In honor of Valentine's Day this week, I'd like to share with you a short poem which is, to put it mildly, my favorite love poem. If you look it up, you will find it all over the internet attributed to Frida Kahlo, who most certainly is not the author. It's such a great poem, and it was originally written in Spanish, that few people would accept that anyone less than Frida Kahlo had written it, but it was in fact written by a Latina grad student in Texas who now works for NPR, whose name is Estefania Maitra. In this magical piece, she asserts, "You deserve a lover who wants you disheveled, with everything and all the reasons that wake you up in haste, and the demons that won't let you sleep. You deserve a lover who makes you feel safe, who can consume this whole world if he walks hand in hand with you. Someone who believes that his embraces are a perfect match for your skin. You deserve a lover who wants to dance with you, who goes to paradise every time he looks in your eyes, and never gets tired of studying your expressions. You deserve a lover who listens when you sing, who supports you when you feel shame, and who respects your freedom, who flies with you and isn't afraid to fall. You deserve a lover who takes away the lies and brings you hope, coffee, and poetry." 3 or 4 cars ago, 15 some odd years, I indulged a long postponed dream when my daughter had finally become a licensed driver and had a car of her own, and I no longer had to chauffeur her and a half a dozen of her friends around town. So I traded in my old Volvo station wagon for a 2-seater convertible. Oh, and it caused a buzz in the church, in much the way that deciding to grow a beard or wearing a suit that's not black or navy blue causes a stir in church. They said that I must be having a midlife crisis or was indulging myself in a childhood fantasy, but call it whatever you want. I just loved having a convertible. In fact, I loved it so much that after about a month of driving it, I actually called the used car dealer where I'd bought it and thanked him for selling it to me, to tell him how happy it had made me. But there was an odd silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "And?" "That's it," I said. "I just wanted to thank you again for selling it to me." This gray-haired old hand in the car industry had evidently never sold a used car and had the buyer call back and say thank you. He was sincerely speechless. Experience had taught him to expect the worst. If you get a call from someone who just bought a used car from you, it's bound to be a complaint, because people don't usually call a used car salesman to say thanks. Oddly enough, being a minister is a lot like that. No one ever schedules an appointment to tell me that their kids are doing well in school, that they'd never had a run-in with the law, that they are dating the most charming and intelligent people. No one ever just drops by the church office to say, "You know, Reverend, I just wanted to let you know that my wife and I are more hopelessly in love than we were 10 years ago when you did our wedding." Of course, I have no way of knowing how many married couples are really happy or how many are just quietly tolerating one another. I'm afraid that many just settle into a quiet acquiescence. The thrill is gone, the passion has cooled, and over time even the curiosity goes away as you become so familiar with one another that you can finish one another's sentences, but you become irrationally irritated by the fact that she is always losing her keys and he never remembers to lock the back door. Poets and playwrights have always waxed eloquent about romantic love, but in all honesty, for most of human history, being in love or being happy is not that relevant to marriage. You don't find a lot of poems in praise of marriage. Trust me, I've looked. I have to do weddings, but it's almost non-existent for a poet to speak well of what it is like to be married. They are crazy about being in love, but marriage seems to change that. Most marriages in history, though, were either directly arranged or they were substantially arranged, and couples stayed together out of a survival need as much as for any religious values or for their reputation. When homes were lit by oil lamps, food was cooked on a wood fire stove, and clothes were washed in a tub and hung on a clothesline to dry, whether your husband had gotten a little big in the middle or your wife's breasts sagged was not something you spent much time worrying about. 100 years ago, pastors did not hear many couples coming in to complain that they just weren't happy, that their marriage wasn't fulfilling to them. In the days before refrigeration, they had to worry more about whether the meat in the smokehouse was safe and still edible, and whether their old horse was going to make it through another winter. It wasn't until World War II when we began to see the American family in rapid evolution. It stayed very much the same for hundreds of years. But during the manufacturing needs of World War II, American women were forced from their homes into offices and manufacturing floors. Prior to the war, most women had contact primarily with their family and with a few neighbors, and a couple of times a week, church folk. But the world of commerce in the midst of global conflict, and their world was forced to change. And they were not necessarily eager to go back to the old ways when that war was over. Wasn't alive then, but I grew up hearing sermons and religious debates that were often focused on getting women to stay in their homes. A married woman with children who tried to keep a career was portrayed as being inherently irresponsible or wayward, maybe even sinful. And a man who couldn't earn enough money to support his family appropriately without his wife having to work for a paycheck was somehow less of a man. My father came home from the war and got a job with the newly formed Rural Electric Corporation, the REA, and for the next 40 years he was involved with stretching the copper wires that made modern life, with all of its labor-saving appliances and conveniences, possible. My mother mostly tried to stay home and raise children, but economically was forced to bounce back and forth between being a housewife or a secretary, often at our church. This time period when genders mixed more not only saw the divorce rate in America rise, but in recent years it has seen more and more people choosing to live alone. Right now, more than half of all American adults are single. Women no longer have to have a husband to bring home the bacon, chop the firewood, and slaughter the pig. They don't even need a husband to raise a child. And I don't need someone who will iron my clothes, cook my dinner, or explain to me why almost everything that I say or do is wrong. Maybe that was just my home life, but I have managed for 30 years as a single man. I don't mean to speak for you and your experience, but I have found out that most clothes don't have to be ironed, and I cook a little too well. I'm generalizing, of course, but for most of human history, family stability was largely maintained by the fact that there was no other practical choice. Families stayed together for unconscious psychological reasons, being the pack animals that we are, but we also stayed together out of economic necessity and for sheer survival. But for the most part, folks, that chapter of human history is in the past. Now couples, at least in the developed world, stay together because they choose to do so. So why do they choose to do so? There is a lot of sexual impulse that we inherit through evolution, and that may be a big part of it, but it's just the beginning. This one thing is true of same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples. Sexual frequency starts out at a high point and it declines pretty quickly in a marriage. It may be uncomfortable to talk about, but it's a nearly universal event. And many people who have been married for several years can't even remember the last time they were sexually intimate. There's an old Italian proverb that says, in the first 5 marriages, you are lovers. In the second 5 years, you are friends. In the third 5 years, you become like a brother and a sister. And in the next 5, you become like 2 sisters. Now, as we tend to live longer than our ancestors, the question we might pose to anyone who starts towards marriage after their childbearing years are past, and when their careers have peaked or been put to bed entirely, what is it that would make you sacrifice your independence as well as some measure of your self-determination in order to enter into a 7-day-a-week partnership under one roof? Again, I think of this on a personal level. Having spent most of my adult life as a single person, what would ever make me change my marital status? What would make it worth it? And the answer to that is meaning. There's a wonderful moment in Robin Williams' movie, The Dead Poets Society, in which he tells his students, medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. My late parents were married for more than 60 years, and I do not doubt that there were moments of real emotional connection between them. But as an observer of nearly 50 of those years, their marriage was mostly about function. They were Puritans with a Protestant work ethic that would have killed Paul Bunyan. They worked, and they cleaned, and they cooked, and they mowed, and they planted and harvested, canned and froze. But what I never saw them do was read to one another. If it were not for the daily newspaper that held each in silence before they went to bed, I would have not been entirely certain that they even knew how to read. And really, if you know how to read but you never do, how is that different from being illiterate? My parents and most of their generation were focused on function. And there were times when it was just a focus on survival. They obeyed the laws, they paid their taxes, they raised their children, they went to church, they retired quietly so that they could criticize the government full time until, in the fullness of time, or maybe a decade later, they both passed away. I'd like to believe that their 60 years together gave them a lot of meaning, but a marriage like theirs is not at all tempting to me. Being single is preferable. And now I've been single for 30 years. I've tried hard when I was married to make marriage work, but since my divorce, I've dated a lot of people. And a couple of times I had some hope that we might make it to the altar. But being past the time of thinking about having children, I've held out. I've held out for a relationship that would be a marriage of equals, a real partnership that was intellectually, spiritually, and maybe even politically compatible. And even more, I wanted a relationship absolutely dripping with romance. And that I have not found. In spite of looking and looking a lot, and with a lot of very disappointing trial and error. At my age, giving up would seem to be the most logical option, but I will share with you that this Valentine's message is pre-recorded. because I am spending this time in Thailand with my significant other, whom I hope will continue to be my more and more significant other until we make the final decision to cast caution aside and tie the knot. Hui is 56 and has never married. I'm 68 and have never had what anyone would call a successful relationship. But we are both nervously and enthusiastically getting closer to making that hand-in-hand jump off the cliff. Those who have been listeners of mine for more than a few years know that I generally return to the writings of the Great Dane, Soren Kierkegaard, when life gets real. The most influential thing in Kierkegaard's life was his broken engagement to the woman he loved more than life itself, Regine Olsen. Kierkegaard was, it's fair to say, psychologically a mess. He was cursed with severe depression, but he loved Regine and found reason for hope and joy in her. But his depression made him doubt that he could ever make her happy. And so he broke off their wedding plans and left the country for a couple of years to let her get on with her life, which she did. Kierkegaard was the one who couldn't get on with his life. He obsessed about her, wrote books about the painful choice between being a philosopher or a husband. At long last, he decided to go back to Copenhagen and ask Regine to take him back, only to discover that she had married someone else while Soren had been in Berlin obsessing about his own issues. He wrote in his journal shortly before his untimely death, "To live without love is a mistake for which there is no reparation, either in this life or in the life to come." I've returned to that quote over and over these past 3 decades. I have felt the desire to share a life meaningfully with a partner, but my own perfectionism has kept me from ever allowing myself to take that step. I'm not sure that I've really moved past that perfectionism, but I believe that I have found someone who is so nearly perfect that she can help me to finish the journey. Because men and women, believe me, to live without love is a mistake. Single life has its moments, but none of those moments rival what it feels like to be in love. To wall ourselves off from meaningful connection is a mistake for which there is no reparation, either in this life or, if you believe in one, the life that is to come. So I cling to a bit of poetry. The whole universe of magic is held in the single verse. You deserve a lover who takes away the lies and brings you hope, coffee, and poetry. Hui doesn't drink coffee, but she likes to smell mine in the morning, and we share it as a kind of communion. You deserve a lover who brings you coffee, that most basic and mundane act of grace in a sleepy household. The first one up brings the other a cup of wake up, it's morning. It's just the civil thing to do. But it is the hero who carries that cup, who can also take away all the lies in the world, who's strong enough to give you hope for the future. Hope is not a cup of coffee. Hope is defiance in the face of all the contrary evidence. It's reason to believe even when the world is dark and full of lies, and the future we know will be cursed with some insane politics, some international violence, and personal suffering. But a lover who will read poetry to you, I believe that's a lover who is willing to share with you their own heart. Someone who will let you see their weakness and their brilliance. Someone who will read poetry to you as you drift off to sleep, will also be there in the morning and will bring you coffee. And when you are in your last days, you will be able to greet your mortality with a genuine sense of contentment.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.